Go.
Hi, Clay.
Hi, how are you?
Very well. Welcome to Free Will. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks very much. Thanks for having me.
I'm Will Wilkinson at the Cato Institute, and you are Clay Shirky, author of the new book, Here Comes Everybody, The Power of Organizing Without Organizations.
Right.
Clay, before we talk about the book in a little more detail, tell us a little bit about yourself. Where are you? What do you do in your day-to-day?
I teach at the Interactive Telecommunications program at NYU, and I work on social software. I work on software that supports group interaction, and I'm particularly interested in the way that human social networks affect communications tools, the design of communications tools, and how the tools affect human social networks. So looking at everything from email and instant messaging to Facebook and MySpace.
Excellent. Now, your book, the thesis is that we're at a sort of a watershed moment with social technology, that it's gotten to a point where we might expect to actually see some real significant changes in our institutions.
Yep.
And one of the ways you set that up, which is music to my economistic libertarian ears, is you mention Ronald Coase's famous paper, A Theory of the Firm.
Right.
And you explain some of what's going on in terms of transaction costs.
Right.
So can you explain a little bit about that and how the new technology is reducing the costs of coordinating in a way that should change the structure of institutions?
Sure. Transaction cost is really the cost of finding anyone else to do business or to work with or associate with. And the question that Coase asked in that paper, Theory of a Firm, is if the market's such a good idea, why have firms at all, right? Why have this command and control piece of an economy that's meant to be essentially free market, people exchanging ideas?
The little island of communism within the free market.
Exactly right. And Coase's answer was that transaction cost, right, the cost of finding and contracting with other people, is enough to get is enough to make directed work essentially a part of the firm's repertoire, right? Being able to tell two employees, you guys work together, you should do the design, you should do the engineering, and be able to make that association is a big part of what makes firms work.
And also the cost of conveying information to the relevant parties, and,
right, exactly.
And the cost of monitoring to make sure that everybody's actually doing the job.
Having contracts, writing contracts, finding counterparties, making sure that the contracts are being abided by, all of those things roll up under transaction costs. And it's made even worse by the fact that, just as a side effect of the mathematics of groups, of the mathematics of networks, as you add more people to a group, the number of internal interfaces grows faster than the size of the group, right? As anybody who's ever tried to sort of get a group of friends to all agree on a restaurant to go to, or to go out to a movie, it's twice as hard to do it with 8 people. It's more than twice as hard to do it with 8 people as with 4 people. In fact, it's 4 times as hard, right? It grows with the square of the number of people. So those two effects taken together, the fact that groups get complex fast and they get bigger, and the transaction costs make it hard to get large groups of people to sort of self-organize, have set a kind of upper limit on what ad hoc groups can get done. Now, what the Internet has done, and increasingly mobile telephony as well, right, as mobile phones plug into a social grid and not just being optimized for sort of person-to-person conversation, what the Internet and mobile telephony have done is they've lowered a lot of those transaction costs. Right, search engines make finding easier. There's all kinds of ways in which people can now collaborate asynchronously, so they don't have to do as much coordinating of their work days and so forth. When you look at really giant scale collaborative projects like Linux or like Wikipedia, what you see is that most of the participants in the effort are only contributing one edit or one patch to the kernel, right? They're not, in fact, people who are coming to work every day, as it were, and working on Wikipedia or working on Linux. Most of the participants are very, very casual. And so the ability to create a project where an individual with one good idea can contribute it and have it be valuable to the whole, that's a new way of collaborating, and it's made possible by the lower transaction costs.
Yeah, I agree with you entirely that, and I think it's hard to predict what sorts of things are going to happen. I think people do take for granted the extent to which our social institutions are a function of the technology that we have available to us.
This to me was the kind of huge backstory to the book, and it wasn't something that I understood going in writing it. But doing all of the research, and particularly the most interesting research I did for the book, was actually about the early history of the printing press, just reading that literature and finding out what happened then. And it is the norm for society to think that anything that's been true for a long time is a deep truth about the universe, right? Mm-hmm. And so, for instance, we've lived in a world where media, there are just media bottlenecks, right? There are publishers of newspapers, there are owners of television stations. And that pattern has been normal for 500 years, since the invention of the printing press. And so it has come to seem to society as if it is deeply true of media that you need essentially a small professional class to manage it. Mm-hmm. But the very kind of conversation we're having now shows the ways that has been upended. And so what we have is a world in which a lot of the social institutions that regard themselves as permanent features of the landscape turn out to have been built on technological accidents of media scarcity, right? And that as that scarcity goes away, a lot of those institutions are being challenged in really quite profound ways. Kinds of challenges that, again, as with the media industry, really any industry or any organization that relies on highly managed control of information is suddenly discovering that their basis for having kind of power and authority in society has largely been built on a kind of a technological accident.
Yeah. There was a talk. This kind of thing came home to me. I don't know, maybe a couple years ago now. I went to see a talk by Camille Paglia.
Yes.
And who's a cultural critic that I like very much. But I just saw it was a moment where I felt like she just had lapsed into old fogeyism, which was that she started lamenting the demise of a uniquely mass culture, right? So the idea is that
the good old days of Gunsmoke.
Yeah, there's 3 television stations. Everybody watches those same shows. There are there is just a number of radio stations. Everybody has to listen to the same pop music or to the same sort of orchestral music on the one public station, and she was sort of lamenting the fact that she's like, Madonna's the last sort of real pop star, and the thing that was discouraging to me is she didn't take the next step and start talking about what's going to happen now. But there was this idea that the culture that's built on top of certain technological constraints that have to do with both the technology and the economics of it, that it's just efficient to provide sort of entertainment at a broad scale because there's not the ability to tailor it more, in a more fine-grained way. It's that kind of sort of reification of the past. If you want to think of it in a Marxist way, a structure of production that kind of keeps you from visualizing how the future might be different.
No, the irony is that publishers, the people who destroyed the Catholic Church as a pan-European political force and left it being merely a religion after the Protestant Reformation. Those people are now arguing for the primacy of highly managed voices that exist in kind of the modern version of cathedrals. Mm-hmm. And there's really, I think, and I've seen a lot of these kind of.
I like one of the stories you have in the book. It's of a former scribe who wants
the Abbot of Sponheim.
Yeah, who wants to defend his profession against the printing press, but wants his ideas to be widely disseminated, so has it printed.
Right, exactly, and of course because he can't go to the scribes. Right, the title of the book is literally in praise of scribes, how great scribes are. Yeah. But then when he finds he wants to get this argument out, he can't actually use scribes because they write too slow. So he has to have the thing printed, and there is this double-edged sword for cultural critics of a certain age. Sven Burkert's up in Boston is sort of my example of old fogeyism. The ability of the web to reach a wider audience is good, but the ability that the web gives other people to reach the same audience is bad, right? Yeah. And that characteristic, I think, it's quite amusing. I grew up in an age when the hand-wringing of media critics was exactly about mass culture, right? The fact that there was this handful of television shows all being crammed down our throats and so forth, and they longed for the days, right? In the 70s and 80s, the idea of getting some kind of really broad and varied culture was the hope. Mm-hmm. And now that it's happened, right? It's upon us. We are in a paradise of abundance and variability of interests. Suddenly, there's another group that comes along and says, "Oh, if only half the country watched Gunsmoke when it was on," right? Famously, the most popular television show in history. And to me, it's hard to take that criticism seriously because they are invariably made by people who benefit from the old scarcities.
Yeah.
Right. Whatever else is true of Polly, she has benefited enormously from there being a handful of sort of official thinkers in society, mm-hmm. And the loss of that set of characteristics is bad for her personally. Which means that any complaint about the death of mass culture as a general phenomenon is kind of bound up into a degree of just intellectual self-dealing.
Well, how much of that do you think is? I mean, I think there's probably, I think my inclinations are very much like yours, but there's an understandable worry that we lose a common culture, right? So that and I think people like Burkhardt kind of get to this kind of point that if everybody's inside his or her own little iPod bubble, listening to his or her favorite kind of music, mm-hmm. and everybody's we've divided society into all these sort of interest group niches where I hang out with sort of Dungeons and Dragons fans who mm-hmm. like techno and Japanese food. Right. That I'll stop having enough in common with my fellow citizens, and that'll have a kind of corrosive effect on sort of our democratic community. What do you make of those kind of arguments?
Well, I mean, they're hard to take seriously because they rely on the existence of a past that never really existed, right? I mean, they harken back to this kind of mix of Grover's Corners and Everybody Watching Laugh-In. But in fact, television destroyed more political culture than it established. Mm-hmm. Right, the removal of people from the public square into their individual homes, even if they were watching the same entertainment, it didn't in fact create a robust political culture. It created an anemic political culture. So, almost all those arguments boil down to life was better when I was younger, mm-hmm. Because the political environment that is nominally the political environment that's nominally being lamented relies, I think, on two straw men. One, the existence of this kind of robust democratic sphere in the age of television, which didn't exist. And second, it relies on the idea that we're all going to become otaku, right? We're all going to become these kind of obsessive single-interest fans of, I'm going to, as you said, I'm going to, hang out with D&D anime people. And that also doesn't happen. Right. When you look at what's happening on the internet, people's interests are becoming more varied and niche, yes, mm-hmm. but they're indulging more of their interests. And they're actually in conversation, lo and behold, with other citizens, not mm-hmm. just passively receiving media. Mm-hmm. So I would worry if the echo chamber effect were real, but it's not. Mm-hmm. People, in fact, don't settle into monocultural clusters. They join lots of different cultural groups that have lots of different interests. And the overlapping and kind of civic engagement of those clusters seems to be a much healthier set of democratic norms than the one we had in the age of TV. Right? Mm-hmm. We're seeing voter registration and voter participation go up mm-hmm. in the age of the internet, not go down. Right, and it declined in every election from 1976 to 2000. So it's hard to argue that we're actually undermining civic engagement when the kind of most important number you could look at in terms of that engagement is actually on the rise.
Well, that's a point about the effects of these cultural changes on consumers. Let's talk a little bit about the production side and about the how new technologies sort of corrode the power of erode the power of media gatekeepers.
Right.
One of the most there's a great book called Durable Inequality by a guy named Charles Tillian. This is where I got this term. That one of the ways you get sort of structural inequality in a society is through what he called opportunity hoarding. That elites basically deal opportunities to their own kids, to people inside their social network. And to some extent, things can be open to talent, but there is a scarce set of really high status and highly rewarded positions in society, and if you can kind of close off those positions and police who gets in, then you can get this sort of stratification that lasts over generations.
Yes, absolutely.
And one of my thoughts about the really empowering thing about a lot of technology on the internet is that it kind of breaks that down. And you you mentioned that this is we're now sort of moving to a framework where it's not like you have to get in the door. You can just start doing stuff.
Right.
And then the good stuff gets filtered out through social processes. So, tell us a little bit more about that.
Well, it was Scott Bradner up at Harvard, I think, who put this best. He said, the internet means you don't have to convince anybody something's a good idea before trying it. And the way the sort of the way I put it in the book is you don't need to ask for help or permission before getting something done. I think one of the things that's caught people by surprise is that the internet has largely been a guruless revolution. Right? There are many people who, in the last 20 years, have understood at one time or another how important this is all going to be, and have spent time and effort explaining it, as I have done in this book and so forth. But then what they've expected is the kind of thing that's happened in previous of these social revolutions, which is that all of the sort of attention and energy that rolls up through the network or through the new technology kind of redounds to their credit. They become the guru, they become the prophet, they become people showing everyone else how it's done. And personal computers don't work that way, the internet doesn't work that way. Once I get how important this is and I'm sat down in front of a web browser, I really don't need a leader, I don't need a guide, I don't need a guru. And in many cases, people who were very excited about these technologies early on came to understood, and in some cases in quite bitter ways, that opportunity hoarding was not really an option here. That you couldn't, just by virtue of understanding how it worked earlier than anybody else, you couldn't build up a set of opportunities that you could keep other people from impinging on. And that's a really big change, right?
Yeah.
That the idea, I mean, there's just one of my students, Patricia Joachim, has sent me just this morning an incredibly interesting story about crime in Brazil, where they've built a crime wiki. And what they're doing is they're creating a bottom-up version of CompStat, the New York City Police's crime management tool, where if a crime is committed, if you're mugged or what have you on the street of Sao Paulo, you go to this map and you can both put on the location of the map where you were mugged, and you can also fill out information. Did they have a gun? Was it one person, many people? And you start to see where the hotspots are. Right? Distrust of police is keeping people from reporting this to the police, and even if the police had the data, the public wouldn't have it. But suddenly the public doesn't need an institution, doesn't need an organization to become organized, right? The organizational capability is inherent in the network, not in any institution built on top of it. And that kind of thing, I think, is really, we're just at the beginning of that, where a group of people, if you find 1,000 people who've been mugged in the same city, you could probably get a good idea of where the hotspots are. But they haven't been able to find each other until now. And now it's starting. Now, right, people really are being able to kind of create the sort of, what do we all know together? How do we aggregate this all? And that undoes precisely this gatekeeper function, which has seemed to be a stable part of society, but actually turns out to have been based in part on just a set of technological bottlenecks that are going away.
So, what do you make of the criticism? So, this is, another sort of thing that you often hear from kind of crotchety elite types is that, well, look, people really need.
The priest argument. They can't be given direct access to the
people
material.
need a little bit of hand holding, right? Like so if you're just letting Amazon.com do all of the book reviewing tasks, then we're going to dumb down the culture. That a certain elite really does have more discerning judgment, and if they can kind of foist that upon everybody else, then we'll be kind of smarter as a society. This sort of thing just kind of like we lose the importance of expertise, and so I don't know if I can even repeat.
You're right, exactly, because you can't go too far in that argument without just cracking up laughing.
Yeah.
No, it is the most ridiculous form of self-dealing on its face. As I say in the book, none of the absolute advantages of expertise have been affected by this. If it was good to know something, if it was good to be an expert in some category of activity or knowledge prior to the age of the internet, then it's still good now. All of the relative advantages of expertise, however, are under assault. And in fact, the people you find who are making that argument most are very often people who sit in positions where what gives them their job is not their expertise, but the structural inequalities of the previous market. Right? Book critics lament this, not because people don't care about books, right? They demonstrably do, and not because people don't want to know what one another thinks about books. They demonstrably do. Book critics lament this because the only thing that made them book critics was a contract from a publisher. If a book critic has something interesting to say, they now have many more media to say it in, and many more people to talk to.
Right.
What they don't want is for other people to have access to the same materials. It's exactly the sadness of the scribe in the age of the printing press, right? You spend your whole life hearing that reading and writing is a good set of skills. It's an important set of skills. It's vital to society. And suddenly, when society comes to agree with you dramatically, right? Yes, reading and writing is good. In fact, it's so good we want everybody to be literate. Suddenly the scribes say, wait a minute. We're not sure that everybody should be able to read and write. And that's the argument the critics are making now. Not everybody should be able to talk about movies or books. The ridiculousness of the argument comes when you point out that there are lots of places that they can go and reach an audience with what they're writing about books. And then it comes back, no, in fact, they want to continue, A, to derive their revenue from the old inefficiencies, and B, they don't like the competition.
Yeah.
Right. So yes, society still cares what experts think. Society still wants to hear informed opinions about all of these things. But you can no longer link those facts to technological accidents in the productive landscape and end up with the job of movie critic in some small town newspaper. All of that is going away. And when you scratch the surface of the society needs arbiters argument, you actually find concern not for real expertise, right? Not for people who are literary critics or movie critics in any kind of deep way. What you find is essentially concern for competition and change, and it's hard to take those kinds of arguments seriously.
Well, here's maybe a more sophisticated version of the argument. So like if you pay attention to sites that basically run entirely on user-contributed content, like Reddit or Dig,
right,
or something like that, then what shows up on the front page is a function of people voting links up and down.
Right.
I like this, I don't like this. After a while, the thing, these sites generally start out pretty good, partly because of the self-selected community.
Right, it's a tiny, highly engaged audience, yes.
Yeah, but over time, as they get more popular...
It's LOLcats.
Then it's just all LOLcats, right? And so suppose the general system is like this, too, that maybe if the people... So I put up a weblog, and like you say, that like every URL is a potential community, right? So I start a blog, and I get a bunch of readers, and some of those readers can offer me opportunities that I wouldn't have had unless I put up the blog. You're much in demand, I'm sure.
Sorry, it's actually my office mate is much in demand. Sorry, I'll turn off in a second.
No problem. But suppose that what's really happening over time is that the people who rise to the top in the more distributed culture are the literary or journalistic equivalent of LOLcats. right? That the people who...
But that's already happened. I mean, you can't look at the rise of People magazine in the 1970s and suggest that somehow we've been defended from those effects. So it is certainly the case that the larger the group is that gets involved in deciding that things are of mutual interest, the more you're going to appeal to the lowest common denominator. But in a way, that's almost definitional, right? The thing that makes dig is that it's the stuff that the largest group is interested in. And where I think that people making that argument, where I think they misunderstand what's happening, is we're not transitioning from one system of leading sites that set the agenda for everybody else to a different system. We're transferring to a system where there is no equivalent of the New York Times in terms of its absolute agenda-setting reach. That in fact, what's not going away, what we're seeing today that's not going away, is the variability. So if you go to Dig or you go to Reddit, you do indeed actually Reddit's a bad example because Reddit has stayed relatively small and technical. But if you go to Dig, right, you're increasingly getting stuff that's of interest to the general population, and it's going the way of People magazine for exactly the same reason. But as many people as go to Dig, they also go to much more sites that are much more perfectly tailored to a particular niche. So, for example, if you go to Albino Black Sheep, which happens to be a user community that's about doing Flash videos and Flash games, right? It's a very intense community of practice. If you go to Howard Forums, you find the cell phone people and so forth. So if you want elevated discourse, there's much, much more of it available today than there was even 5 years ago. Right? I read a site called Crooked Timber. That's a bunch of sociologists and economists hashing out the issues of the day against the background of long-term philosophical and research-driven thinking about sociological issues. It's incredibly good. It's incredibly interesting. It's much more highbrow than the average front page of the New York Times.
Oh, yeah.
So it's a shift from supply-side control to demand-side variability. And people who are coming out of the old media world don't understand that. They assume that the most popular things are going to be so much more popular than the niche things, and that there will be so few niche things in general, and that they will be so unimportant. That over a long period of time, right, that the culture is just going to fall down this sinkhole. In fact, variability is the principal product of the internet. We just have a lot more ways of interacting with one another and of finding the kind of content we want. And the genie's never going back in the bottle, right? We're never going to re-scarcify in this environment.
Well, you know this book by Barry Schwartz, The Paradox of Choice?
Yes.
Yeah. So, he argues that like moral options aren't really a good thing, that we can get, like, having all this stuff out there, all this variability, it's hard to know what you want. It causes us a lot of anxiety. There's something deeply comforting about having a pre-designated social role.
So I agree with the Schwartz argument. First of all, it's just he's got the data to prove it, right? People past a certain point, too much choice makes people freeze up.
Well, he's got the data to show that when it's an unfamiliar choice,
right? So here's the thing, right? People need limited sets of choices, right? They need and people self-limit. What people jumping from the Schwartz argument to the we must have the leading media outlets argument don't understand is that the limited set of choices doesn't have to be the same for every user.
But then you have to choose which arbiters you're going to.
Yes, that's right.
And it is kind of, it's like this fractal where you have to, you're trying to diminish the choice, but then you have all these different communities who help you decide, but then you have to choose which community to be a part of, and then you need like a community that's going to help you choose the choice community, and so on and so forth.
Well, but it doesn't. I mean, it is fractal, but not infinite, which is to say, if you can simplify the choice, if by choosing the communities you go to, you simplify the choice by 2 orders of magnitude, that's enough, right? People talk a lot about the information overload problem. There is no information overload problem, or rather, there has always been an information overload problem since the invention of the printing press, right? Which is the first moment when there was more to read than you could read in a lifetime, right? So we've always had that problem. What we're seeing now is the filter failure problem, right? We used to have good ways of filtering because the environment was relatively scarce. Now we don't. But the adoption of, you say, I'm going to go to my Yahoo for news, and I'm going to look at Slashdot for techie news, or I'm going to go to Google News for news, and I'm going to go to Dig for techie news, or whatever. Those choices almost everybody makes, right? It's a very common pattern. They get access to the internet, they wander around, they forage widely, they find a bit of this and a bit of that. A year later, they'll have picked 3 or 4 things that become their way of managing the width versus depth trade-off, the paradox of choice. And that process, right, that filtering process, is part of what it means to take advantage of the variability of the net. So the people who use the Schwartz argument to argue that we need arbiters are making a category error. They're ascribing to individual people something that they think should be true of society. Mm-hmm. You and I each need some relatively steady exposure to the same group of people, to the same, sets of sites, and we also need some variability. And people have different preferences, but almost everybody picks 1 or 2 communities they belong to and 1 or 2 media sites that they follow. It is not at all the case, and I think society would be worse off if those communities and those sites were the same for everybody.
Right.
So the fact that there is a bottleneck at the point of how much choice we're comfortable being exposed to does not at all mean that any 2 people drawn at random from the same society should have the same limitations on choice. Mm-hmm. They should, in fact, be able to pick their own limits just as they should be able to pick their own anything.
Yeah, the way I like to put the problem is I think that you can think of it as there's both too few and too many choices. That if you have a fairly strongly individualist view, which I do, yeah, then you tend to think that people are unique, and that there are products and services and communities that will be uniquely tailored to them, that will have a certain kind of fit. And there's a lot of satisfaction and a lot of happiness that comes from getting the right fit between your job, the kinds of things you consume, the kind of status competitions you're a part of. Mm-hmm. Yep. So that right fit is a really central part of a good life. Yep. And a lot of us, it's hard to find that fit, and part of the reason is that some things that would be a good fit just don't quite exist yet.
Right.
And so there's not enough choices in that sense. And so we want them to proliferate. But the more choices we get, as the sort of a commercial order trundles on and throws up all of these new variations, mm-hmm, then the cost of searching that space goes up. Yes. And so although that one thing, that diamond with my name on it is out there somewhere, I have to basically sort through the landfill looking for it. Yep. And so that's the problem that we have now, is that either the choices that the things that really fit us don't exist yet, or if they do, they're too hard to find.
Right. And it's interesting, back to the earlier conversation about costs and transaction costs. One of the things I observed is that there is a new class of things you can participate in as a contributor, or just media you can go to as a user, that exists under what I'm calling the Coasian floor, right? Mm-hmm. There are collections of photos on Flickr. The one I use is photos of the Mermaid Parade out in mm-hmm. Brooklyn, our sort of annual spring parade. You can find a bunch of photos of hula hooping and roller skating mermaids, right? People sort of go around Coney Island. There's no profit motive that would get people to aggregate those photos. There's no non-profit that would spend its donors' mm-hmm. money uploading and making available photos of hula hooping mermaids. But there the photos are. Because it's now easy for a non-institutional group to create value that's too expensive for an institutional group.
Right.
So I think the paradox is, or the sort of twin forces we're managing are, there are many, many, many more places for people to find some reflection of themselves and some happiness in participating than there mm-hmm. used to be. But getting to them is harder. Mm-hmm. When Yahoo launched in '94, what they were saying was, there's so much abundance here that a filtering business, forget everything else for a moment that Yahoo became, a filtering business is a really good business to be in. Mm-hmm. The critical mistake, Yahoo has been around for about 15 years. It's only made one really major mistake, and it's in that entire time. But it was an almost instantly fatal one, which is they got out of the filtering business.
They stopped doing the index?
Yes. Terry, not the index so much. The index stopped working because abundance broke even the index.
Yeah.
They stopped doing the search engine. Terry Semel said, oh, now we're settling down to a world where it's all going to be about scarcity and quality, so we're going to go cut all these Hollywood deals. And he was wrong. Mm-hmm. And he was dead wrong, and Yahoo will probably be gone by the end of next month as a result of that. And Google came along, and Dig came along, and Reddit came along, and NetVibes came along, and all of these businesses come along. And I have never seen, in any point in the last 15 years, a day where you couldn't get up and think, you know what a really good new business to start today would be? Mm-hmm. It would be really good to start a business that helped people sort the good stuff from the crap. Right? The filtering problem, whatever else has gone on with the internet, e-commerce and social networking and all the rest of it, every single day of the commercial web's life, filtering is the critical function.
Yeah.
And we are so early in that. I mean, it took decades, in some cases centuries, for the post-printing world to settle down on newspapers are like this, whereas magazines are like that, and mm-hmm. novels are like this other thing. Nonfiction is different from fiction. All of those filters we rely on every day in the paper world, those weren't established for decades. So for the foreseeable future, we're going to be in that world on the internet, where trying to figure out what's a good fit between an individual and the enormity of resources out there mm-hmm. Is going to be a hard problem, and all the solutions are going to be provisional and overlapping. Getting that right is, in a way, the job of our society right now.
Mm-hmm. You know what, I'm finding you're just inspiring a thought. I was just thinking about what is it that I do when I'm blogging. And part of it's you're just serving as a filter for other people. Mm-hmm. But when I'm trying to find something, what I used to do was I had sort of like a link roll on the side of my blog, yep. and I would just kind of go through the blogs of my friends.
Yep.
For some reason that doesn't seem to work anymore.
Yep.
So I have an RSS feed that yep. That gives me I use Google Reader. It has, but I've gotten to the point where I've got too many blogs in it now.
Yes.
So I can't actually review all the blogs that I've selectively chosen to give me news. So then I end up so then you end up with these nice functions that say like Google Reader has, where it knows all your friends from your Gmail, address book.
Yep.
And knows who it is that you G-chat with, and
yep.
adds them as friend. And I found that incredibly useful. Like the things that my friends who are also bloggers in their task of filtering, mark as
yes.
worthwhile. Yes. But that process will just keep iterating.
I think that's right.
But what people are relying on when you have a good blog that people like, partly it's the individual's voice, but it's you're trusting that person's editorial judgment. But having editorial judgment in this kind of atmosphere means being able to avail yourself of technology in a certain sort of way.
Yeah, no, you have to.
And being a part of a certain kind of social network, that you need to be part of a filtering network that diminishes your search costs.
And this is really a classic web model. It's been true from the earliest days of web applications, where we're really good at doing things for individual users, and we're really good at doing things for the whole world. We're not so good at doing things for groups. And mm-hmm. in almost all cases, right, backing things into social infrastructure, backing things into groups out of the sort of either for one person or for everybody, saying, no, this is really just for a selective group. Right? There's no complicated technology under the hood in Facebook or MySpace. There's nothing that you couldn't have built in theory mm-hmm. In the 90s. But the social density and the kind of awareness of essentially the value of being part of this group, as with your Google Reader group, mm-hmm. Was just a long time coming. And one of the reasons I did the book now is that value is now really apparent to people.
Yeah, well, let's talk about one of the examples of collaboration, because it's close to my heart, where you see the change in the structure that the end product is a function of the social structure, but you didn't know that you needed a different social structure. And one of those examples is the transition from Newpedia to Wikipedia.
Right.
I was a section editor on Newpedia. I was on the board.
Oh my goodness.
Because Jimmy Wales and Larry Sanger were friends of mine from email discussion lists in the early 90s.
You were part of the epistemology group?
We were on the moderated discussion of objectivist philosophy, which Jimmy Wales ran, was the admin for.
Right.
And that's actually how I got into philosophy, which was I met, the internet was an important thing for me for just building a social network that let me know that I had options available. But early on, these guys that I knew were going to make this encyclopedia, and I signed up, and it was great seeing that process start, but it was a disaster at the beginning because they set up Newpedia to be an alternative to, the idea was to have an encyclopedia that's constantly updated instead of, and a good example of that format is online is the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy.
Yes.
Which is an excellent product, and it's based around the model that Newpedia had in mind.
Right.
That you have these entries that experts are constantly updating, so it's always refreshing itself. But as I can attest, somewhere in some defunct hard drive, I have a half-written entry on the paradox of analysis or something like that. Nobody ever finished anything on Newpedia. You tell the rest of the story. Yeah.
Well, so you've essentially set it up. I mean, the dilemma with Newpedia is that they adopted the kind of command and control structure, at least the motivational structure that you have inside an institution like, say, Stanford, right? Famously publish or perish. Nobody has the or perish option on the web, right? I mean, it's if you're recruiting people, you have to get them to do things because they care about them.
Yeah.
And so Newpedia had this long process, which you obviously were part of, sort of check in the article and take it through these sort of 7 quality control, quality assurance steps before you publish it. Mm-hmm. And the Wikipedia model was an attempt to get out of that logjam because Newpedia ended up with some 24 articles after 9 months of work. Yeah. Wikipedia, Sanger started by saying on the Newpedia mailing list, go try this other thing, this wiki thing, and we're gonna try this out. Just go create an article. It'll take all of 5 or 10 minutes. It'll be easy. And 2 things happened immediately. One, Wikipedia took off. Right, it was apparent that in fact this is a much quicker way to get content up and out in public. And 2, the Newpedia board, right, the editorial board that had been recruited from Newpedia, revolted. They said this isn't sufficiently deferential to experts.
Right.
And so they kicked the nascent wiki off the Newpedia site, which is why they had to come up with the Wikipedia name. And interestingly, Sanger has now launched Citizendium, which is an attempt to resuscitate Newpedia, at least the Newpedia model, by having explicit deference to experts in the mix. Mm-hmm. It's not working. It's not working very well. Mainly, what they're doing is spidering Wikipedia, and they are creating new articles. But so much of the overhead, if you go on Citizendium, so much of the energy is out about actually discussing the rules rather than making the content.
Right.
The remarkable thing about Wikipedia, and I think the thing that people often don't understand, is that it isn't amateurs producing it, except in the sense of people who are doing it for love. Right. In many cases, there's deep domain expertise reflected in the Wikipedia articles, which people have a hard time believing because if no one's being paid for it or ordered to do it by their boss, why would they do it? The answer is the people writing the articles love the subject. Mm-hmm. My favorite Wikipedia article is the Pluto article. It's the one I've been watching for several years just as a kind of touchstone for what's happening. And I started watching when Pluto was in the middle of getting kicked out of the planetary system because there was then this huge flame war and this big question of how do we rewrite this article and how quickly can we do it? And they did it incredibly quickly, and it was apparent that the people writing about it, they were experts. They really knew what they were doing. Mm-hmm. And the surprise from the Newpedia model to the Wikipedia model is how much voluntary division of labor is actually possible. Right? We've had this idea from Henry Ford that division of labor has to be done by the boss of the assembly line. Mm-hmm. In fact, people are self-assigning, right? I'm cleaning up this, and you're going to do that. I'm going to fix a typo, and you're going to add a paragraph. And 2, how tolerant the public is of process. Right? Wikipedia is best viewed not as a product, but as a process. Yeah. There's an article I track in the book where the article on asphalt went up in the early months of Wikipedia's life, and it said asphalt is a material used for covering roads, right? 7 words. Mm-hmm. Now when you go to look at asphalt, I last looked at it in 2007, now it's 2008, it was 2 5,000-word articles, one on the chemical composition of the black stuff that is asphalt itself, and then the other is about asphalt cement, which is the chemical, the black sticky stuff plus gravel. Mm-hmm. And it went from this, crappy little 7-word observation that was basically sort of a well-duh article to being 2 incredibly technically detailed articles, and it went there one step at a time, mm-hmm. right? And a lack of faith in evolution and a lack of understanding of the difference between process and product leads a lot of people into this very curious thing. I see it in the academy all the time. People standing up and arguing that Wikipedia can't work. And then you ask them for an article. Just mm-hmm. pick one at random. Let's go look. Let's see how it is. And it becomes apparent they've never actually looked at the thing. They just
mm-hmm.
like the idea of it.
Yeah.
And they're often quite startled to see how good the content actually is.
Yeah. Every semester I give a talk on online research methods
uh-huh.
to the interns here at Cato.
Yep.
And when I get to the Wikipedia part of the talk, and it's interesting because it occurred to me, when I'm telling them how to think about Wikipedia as a reference resource,
yep.
basically I'm telling them to think about what they think the social process behind it would be.
Oh, that's interesting.
So,
right.
yeah, but I hadn't. It could be because basically I've just given them kind of a hierarchy of reliability,
right.
which is sort of like if you go to something that's scientific or technical, the internet is full of geeks who will be incredibly fastidious. You can be sure that Pluto is correct.
Yes, exactly.
Don't worry about it. You can look at the for hydrogen, its entry, it's going to be better than anything you can find anywhere.
Right.
And then I go, but even if you take something more controversial, like go look at the entry for the minimum wage. Right?
Oh, I bet that's really good.
It's actually quite good. But you can go and look, hit the talk tab and see the whole debate about what's going to show up on the page. It's actually an incredibly good way of educating yourself about what the relevant issues are.
Yep.
The page is actually really high quality in terms of its content. But if it's something that's likely to be controversial, don't just take it at face value. Do go look at the talk page to see what the process generated. And then if it's something that's going to be like, the page for Hillary Clinton, and you can understand that some people are going to have
yes.
a motivation to deface it,
yep.
Then think about that. But
check it a couple of times to see if you've gotten one of the defaced or modified versions.
Yeah. So it changes your thinking from thinking about whether this was written by the relevant authorities to thinking about whether this was produced by a community and social process that's likely to be reliable.
Right.
And I think that's becoming natural to sort of a younger generation, but it seems strange to an older generation.
Right. One of the functions of expertise is to lessen blame. And we don't like to admit this. Mm-hmm. But in fact, one of the advantages of consulting the experts or authorities is that if something goes wrong, you can throw up your hands and say, well, I talked to all the best people. How could I have gotten this wrong?
Exactly.
You'll see this process at work inside the Beltway for people who got the Iraq War spectacularly wrong. Mm-hmm. Spectacularly wrong. Almost every bit of conclusion, whether it's about WMDs or about the likelihood of a coherent state emerging after the removal of Hussein, has turned out to be just false in ways that have weakened the U.S.'s position in the world. Mm-hmm. And the conversation now, quite interestingly, isn't let's go out and find the people who got it right and try and understand what they were thinking. The conversation is, how could the experts have gotten it so wrong? Mm-hmm. And when you look at, for instance, the Britannica article on the Caribbean, it's self-serving, right? It was written as a kind of apologia for the age of empire. And it has exactly the characteristics you're talking about with the Hillary Clinton article on Wikipedia, mm-hmm. which is to understand why the entry on the states of the Caribbean is the way it is in Britannica, you have to understand Britain's relationship to the Caribbean, and you have to understand the Britannic editor's relationship to Britain. And without that, right, you actually can't take Britannica's assertions about the Caribbean at face value.
It's a great example, yeah. Let's talk for a minute. I keep pushing you off on tangents, but I wanted to get...
they're all tangents. I mean, that's the thing, is this stuff is going so broadly that effectively it's all one big collection of tangents.
Yeah, so one of the big, the thrusts of the book is by, sort of reducing the cost of coordinating, creating sites around which people can build communities, by which people can identify and solve otherwise insoluble collective action problems, that something's going to change. Give us your best example of examples of collective action that you don't think could have happened without the sort of facilitating technology of the internet, and give us an example then of what sort of thing you might think might be likely in the near future.
So one of the great ones was last summer when HSBC, the bank, went and recruited a bunch of UK college students and recent graduates and said, we'll give you interest-free check, or penalty-free checking, rather. If you have an overdraft, you owe us back the money, but we're not going to charge you anything extra. Mm-hmm. Well, this is great, right? If you're a student, this seems like a good deal. So they recruit thousands of new customers to the service. And then over the summer, after the students have dispersed critically, HSBC says, did we say no charge? We actually meant £140, which is like $1,000 American. Mm-hmm. I don't know what the exchange rate is, but it's
about 2 to 1 almost.
It's a chunk of change, And the students, right? The HSBC has two advantages over the students. One, they have an information advantage. It's hard to figure out how to change your bank account from HSBC to another bank. And because it's such a hassle, right, they figured most of these students aren't going to do it. And two, they can't take any collective action because they're so dispersed, right? They're all backpacking in Europe or summer jobs or whatever they're doing. They hadn't been on Facebook. And a guy named Wes Streeting at Cambridge put up a page called Stop the Great HSBC Ripoff. Mm-hmm. And he got thousands of students to come in and start a virtual protest on Facebook. And two things happened right away. One, just out of regard for their fellow students, right? People wanted to get attention from their fellow students. They started documenting, here's how you change from one kind of bank account to another. So there goes the information advantage. And then, right, the virtual protest started making the press. And HSBC is looking bad. And then the students say, you know what, we're all going to be back to school in September. We're going to go down to London. We're going to protest in front of HSBC headquarters. So there goes the coordination advantage. Mm-hmm. And HSBC then capitulates and says, oh, you know what, we're a customer service organization. We actually, we didn't realize that this would make people upset. Which, of course, is a lie, as those kinds of PR statements are. Mm-hmm. What they really meant was, we didn't know the students would be upset and coordinated. And it was that second thing, which would not have been possible, I think, even in 2005. Facebook was around, but it wasn't ubiquitous, right? So it isn't just the new tools, it's also social density that solves these problems. Mm-hmm. Where it's going, I think, is interesting. A lot of the collective action problems we're seeing get solved are based on stop energy. Right. They're based on getting people to stop doing things. Mm-hmm. They're protest movements, they're complaints, they're citizen uprisings and so forth. We're not seeing a lot of collective action for starting things or sustaining things yet. Mm-hmm. And here's what I think is coming. Right. In the same way that the general public license, the GNU license for free software, or the Creative Commons license for written material, uses copyright law to actually increase the availability of material rather than decreasing. Right? Yeah. It presents to the state as if it's ordinary copyright law, but the way the contract is written, it actually guarantees freedoms rather than restrictions. I think that's coming for incorporation. I think that we are going to start to see a set of companies that are established to look like corporations to the state and to fall under corporate law. Yeah. But will actually encapsulate these sort of internet-style collective action coteries, and enable them to do things. David Johnson, a law professor down at New York Law School, is actually working with the state of Vermont on this idea of the virtual company. He calls it the Virtual Company Project, which allows a group of people who coordinate in ways that we would recognize from any sort of internet group coming together, to nevertheless incorporate and present themselves to the state as a corporation, which means they get all the deference the state gives to corporations when they take decisions together.
They get a certain kind of legal personhood that they wouldn't
That is
otherwise
exactly
have.
what they get. They get legal personhood.
I was actually thinking of something similar that having to do with corporate governance. In that one of, I mean, it's been a known issue for a long time, is that there's these huge asymmetries between the boards of publicly traded companies and the power of their shareholders who don't know who the other shareholders are. Right. I mean, there are some sort of like democratic shareholder activists, but it's very, very difficult to coordinate shareholders in order to make to take concerted action against the board if the corporation seems to be acting against the interest of its actual owners.
And the advantage the board has over the shareholders are precisely the two advantages that HSBC had over the students it had offered and then reneged on this deal. And one, they've got an information advantage, and two, they've got a coordination advantage. It would be really interesting to have essentially a parallel corporation that also had legal personhood, that was made up of membership by the shareholders, and the function of the novel company was essentially to present shareholder will to the board. That would be an amazing legal tangle. I am not a lawyer; I can't speculate as to the outcome of such a thing. But I do think that the shareholders are one of those groups whose distributed interest would mean that a little bit of sort of coordinating energy and platform could create quite incredible effects.
Yeah, that would be an amazing thing. One thing that I think some of this kind of thing, like I've been in the kind of libertarian free market community for a long time. I find all these sorts of changes exciting. But I notice that like even an older generation of people in the same community see things like Linux or Wikipedia, things that are created through the motive of sort of love instead of money, as being somehow suspect or sort of like quasi-communist. Which strikes me as completely absurd, and a way of sort of reifying. There's this idea that especially if you're an economist, that here's especially if you have a certain kind of money-focused notion of what incentives are. They're like, here are the incentives. Here's why people do things. People do things because they're rewarded. But
people do things because they're rewarded. It's just the reward is not always money.
Yeah.
I mean, if you want to give those people an insight into what's going on, and you want that insight to come from their life instead of yours, ask them if they sing happy birthday to their own children, or if they hire professionals to come over to the house and do it. Because if they understand that they are singing happy birthday to their children because the motivation and reward in that situation isn't about money, and it isn't about quality on any kind of linear metric, they can understand what's going on with Wikipedia. What's changed isn't that we have economic motivations and we have motivations for love. What's changed is that the radius and half-life of what we can get done for love have increased so dramatically in the last 10 years that it's now bumping into places where we used to only be able to use money to motivate people.
Yeah.
So
and there's a symbiosis between
absolutely.
Once people become wealthy enough, then you have a margin of leisure with which to do work that just satisfies you intrinsically.
All of civilization has been an answer to one question, which is, what are we going to do with this surplus? The earliest surplus was the agricultural surplus. Actually, probably the earliest surplus was the people surplus. As somehow our birth and death rates stopped leaving the population in stasis, but gave us some growth. There have been surpluses of intellectual energy. There have been surpluses of physical energy, right? The de-animization of work moving from animals to the steam engine. At every point, the answer to the question, what are we going to do with the surplus, has led to answers that are good for society. But it has also led to a panic on the part of society that is used to a pre-surplus world. This is just, right now, the surplus is leisure time. The surplus is people high enough up the Maslowian hierarchy that they have enough time and energy to sit around improving an article on Pluto in a free encyclopedia. The idea that they should stop doing that and just go back to watching television and doing nothing productive with their leisure time at all strikes me as nothing short of insane.
Yeah, people like work.
People like work and they like recognition, and our previous answer to what are we going to do with the surplus has been sit at home and watch TV. And to take all of that capacity and turn it into something productive strikes me as one of the great inventions of civilization.
That's phenomenal. One thing that makes me think of is thinking about the fragmentation of communities. One of the upsides of that is that there's always complaints about the rat race. Right, that people are worrying when you worry about your status.
Yes.
Then what you do is you're worried about getting a bigger car than your next door neighbor.
But you said it right. Part of the trick is just to help people find status games they like playing.
Yeah, and so this is a world in which you can have a middle management job that maybe you don't love that much, but it pays the bills and it leaves you comfortable.
And you can rule your Warcraft guild.
Yeah, and you can rule your Warcraft guild,
yes.
or you can be like a Wikipedian who's highly respected in that community,
Absolutely.
or you can be coding some part of Firefox. You've taken over like this one little tiny corner of the graphic, user interface or something, and that in that community you're respected and beloved, and you can get that sense of status that you never would have gotten in a larger sort of mass economy.
That's right. Right. In a mass economy, there's a narrow range of status games, and in a diverse economy, and particularly in a an economy where many of the motivations are non-financial. Which many economists have a hard time even recognizing as an economy. In that kind of environment, right? People can find the games they like to play. They can find the community they want to be a mocker in or be an integral part of, and it doesn't always have to be work.
Well, I think that's a good place to end. We're just about out of time.
Very good.
Clay Shirky, you are somebody in your little world.
Yes, indeed. Right, I found a game I like to play.
Congratulations on your new book. Here Comes Everybody, The Power of Organizing Without Organizations.
Thanks very much.
And hope to catch you again sometime soon.
Great. Okay, thanks very much.
Take care.
Good to talk to you.